I knew what they meant by Utrecht, of course, but I had never heard Arras referred to in the Dutch, and I haven't since then. But I think that this question, or this exchange, posed a question: was it Arras or Utrecht? And that's something that sits at the center of my discussion today. Who gets to claim this place, and why might they try to claim it? Now the capital of the Pas-de-Calais department, Arras is situated about 50 kilometers from Lille in what is now northern France. But Arras's Frenchness, as I continue to discover in new ways, is not without contention. Where Arras sits historically in geopolitical terms is complicated. Under the French crown in the mid-9th century, it became the seat of the County of Artois. By the second decade of the 10th century, it became part of the County of Flanders. And it returns to French hands again in 1191, becomes the County of Artois again in 1237, then eventually is part of the Spanish Netherlands, and then recaptured by the French in 1640. It changes hands almost once a century, its geographic position making it constantly the topic of arguments. In the Middle Ages, Arras was an important religious, financial, and cultural center. Of particular importance to this paper, the city fostered what was truly a remarkable literary, theatrical, and musical culture throughout the long 13th century. It was home to poets and composers and what was clearly a very high density of musicians. Much ink has been spilled about this era of Arras's history by not only local historians and writers, but also modern scholars in a wide variety of disciplines. The trouvères, or poet-composers active in the wider region of Northern Europe during the 13th century, were highly prominent in Arras. And I'll discuss later how it was sort of crowned the center of trouvère activity by 19th century scholars. Despite the complicated geopolitical position of the city outlined just a moment ago, the vast majority of scholarly literature that deals with Arras casts its significance within the context of 13th century France. It's predominantly discussed as France, with little room for exploring how its constantly changing status affected issues of identity. And although we're now keenly aware that the poetry of the southern counterparts of the trouvère, the troubadours, was Frenchified and taken up by French nationalists well before the 19th century, there's little, if any, acknowledgement that the area that the trouvère straddles, trouvère were active in straddles the modern border between France and Belgium. But even clarifying this is not French, but Francophone song, still fails to capture the fact that until the early 20th century, certain areas in which the trouvère were active were still multilingual. So in short, there's been, to my mind, something of a concealment of the city's true medieval history and a failure to take stock of the complexities in the region in which it sat. My talk today starts with what might seem like a simple premise, that the way that we talk about the city of Arras in the 13th century, and particularly its remarkable literary and musical outputs of its inhabitants, that's sort of the main focus of my talk, falsely foregrounds an identity that is cleanly French. The reason for this, I think, is because rarely do we look at the cultural outputs of the trouvère in locally specific terms. The legacy of the individuals who I'll speak about at the end of my talk, French philologists that incorporated trouvère into French history at the end of the 19th century, continues to dominate our modern scholarly narratives and speaks in a language of unity and coherence that should probably give us a bit of a pause. So taking a local approach, focusing only on a singular city, allows for a degree of nuance and an appreciation for the way that the geopolitical borders of this region shifted throughout history, not least in the high medieval period and in the 19th century. But that's the simple premise. The truth is that it's really not simple at all. And that's because before the French Revolution, the trouvères were deeply incorporated into French literary history already. But in the first decades of the 19th century, we see competing claims to the cultural heritage of medieval Arras, in no small part because of the foundation of Belgium and its separation from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. It would be nice if I could align all of the people here to solely French or Belgian nationalism. And believe me, when I started writing this, when I was writing my dissertation, I desperately tried to and realized what a failure that was going to be. But this is where it gets really messy, because some of the local historians or scholars that I'll talk about in the next 45 minutes did see Arras as important in terms of its incorporation into nationalist histories, but not all of them did. In fact, the competing claims for the city's history took on various forms, ranging from Belgian nationalists who curiously left the Aragois alone, to speakers of West Flemish who accepted the nationhood of France. As such, they clearly demonstrate how it was impossible to speak of Arras as a place that belonged to France or Flanders or Belgium, and how the complexity of that region in which it sits still continues to plague conceptions of identity today. So in what follows, I'll follow three quote unquote generations of scholars whose work deals with medieval Arras. Some of them in sort of very large ways, others only touch on it tangentially, which culminates in the city's cultural life being taken up rather successfully by French philologists at the end of the 19th century. Along the way, we'll meet figures whose biographies alone attest to the messiness of the region, to its multilinguality, to the issue of nascent Belgian identity, and to the impact of non-local scholars on the region's history. I'll end with some reflections of my own, both personal and intellectual, about what Arras is today and how it fits into European identity formation in what I think that we can all agree is a very critical moment in history. As a foreigner who's been living in the Low Countries now for a number of years, I'd also just like to conclude my introduction with this. The more that I learn about this region's history, the less that I realize I know. And I think that we can all sort of understand what that feels like. That's sort of a normal scholarly feeling, but I think it's especially pertinent to studying the Low Countries. And as such, I'm very open to all of your questions and comments. The French Revolution came to a close. France began the arduous task of reassembling itself as a unified whole. The city of Arras, the home to of the revolution's architect, Maximilien Robespierre, bore noticeable scars from the recent unrest. Arras Cathedral and the Abbey of Saint-Vaast had been destroyed, leaving the city's urban landscape unrecognizable. An estimated 160 Aragois had been guillotined, and in June of 1794, 1,328 people were still held in the city's 7 prisons. It was only after the revolution that Arras would be crowned as the center of Trouvère activity, a fact that is hardly contestable today. Previously, the Trouvères were well-known figures in the history of Francophone literature from at least the 16th century. And by the time the revolution had begun, they were considered natural successors to the ancient bards. The majority of Trouvères valorized pre-revolution, however, were aristocratic, and they thus lacked an appeal at the dawn of the 19th century. As musicologist John Haynes writes, the Trouvères survived the revolution because they were too well established as a national institution and still vital to French historical interests. The Trouvères might survive this upheaval, but in order to thrive, they'd have to respond to the post-revolutionary climate. And so enter Adam de la Halle, the Aragois poet par excellence. Adam's status rose throughout the early 19th century and provided the ideal antidote to the aristocratic Trouvère who French antiquarians pre-revolution had appreciated. Haynes recognizes that in this post-revolution repackaging of the Trouvère, this new type of model for a French medieval poet was sought, one that was not aristocratic, yes, but also who in biography and works represented post-revolutionary sentiments. And as a member of the medieval Aragois urban bourgeoisie, Adam fit the bill perfectly, and he became Arras's prodigal son. In considering how various early scholars perceived Adam's significance, we start to see a variety of approaches to acknowledging the messy geographical placement of the city, and how Arras became a significant center in its own right. Francois Josephitis looms large in the history of the discipline of musicology, particularly for his pioneering work on music before 1600. Born in Mans to a musical family in 1784, he studied and then later taught at the Paris Conservatory before returning to Belgium as the first director of the Royal Conservatory in Brussels in 1833 at the direct request of Leopold I. Musicologist Catherine Ellis has shown that Fitis was an ardent Belgian nationalist, a feature of his biography that was pronounced even during the years that he spent in Paris. Perhaps most famously for musicologists, he argued that the Franco-Flemish polyphonists of the 15th and 16th century were not, as had long been argued, French, but actually Belgian. In an 1826 article on important discoveries of musical manuscripts, Fitis published a field-changing revelation about the Trouvère Adam de la Halle. That was that not only had Adam composed a significant corpus of monophony or single voice music, but so too was that he a polyphonist. It's difficult to emphasize how important this discovery was in terms of musicology. That an Aragois poet was capable of creating polyphonic music raised the status not just of Adam, but also of the city of Arras. And I'd caution against thinking that polyphony is more complicated or even better than monophony. As Ellis shows, even Fitis thought that Adam's polyphonic works were subpar to his monophonic songs. But this revelation really helped to secure Arras's importance in a long-term way. At the very end of the article, Fitis takes an interesting and I think noteworthy turn. We get all of the standard lingo that we'd expect. Adam is superior in his compositional techniques to other Trouvères, he knows how to compose in multiple parts, etc. Fitis suggests that the practices of polyphony might have been known in the region because of the Italians, as we hadn't known that these techniques were available in France before. And he finally sums up with, we see in the centuries that follow how Gallo-Belgian musicians surpass these same Italians. The use of Gallo-Belge is certainly a choice, and I think it's quite a careful one. We could read this as Fétis trying to claim Adam for the Belgians, as he does with the Franco-Flemish polyphonists of a few centuries later. But I don't think that's entirely what's happening. If anything, I read a bit of reticence in this passage, almost an anxiety about where to place Adam. There's a mention of France and then a turn to Gallo-Belge at the end. I'd like to posit a theory, which is that that Fétis is claiming Adam and that the Arras of the mid to late 13th century wouldn't be an easy task for Belgium. By the time that Adam was around, Arras was clearly not the county of Flanders. But rather than calling it cleanly French, Gallo-Belge allows for a space in between, an acknowledgement that this was a region frequently fought over. Gallo-Belge then helps to recognize the impossibility of either France or Belgium claiming Adam or Arras, and harkens back to a much earlier time when this entire region was sort of united as one. A similar acknowledgement of the messiness of the region was encapsulated in the work of journalist and bibliophile Arthur Dinault in his 4-volume Trouvère jongleur et ménestrel du Nord de la France et du Midi de la Belgique, published between 1837 and 1863. Dinault was an educated member of the middle class, born in the city of Valenciennes, directly on what would become the Franco-Belgian border. He belonged to a countless number of academies and societies, from Arras to Liège. He published the 4 volumes with a planned 5th volume on Picardy, which went unfinished upon his death in 1864. Both in his title, acknowledging both France and Belgium, and in separating his volumes into provinces across the Franco-Belgian border, Dinault recognized that the lyric poetry of the Trouvère was one that was sort of shared across that border. In the volume treating Flanders and Tournai, he further acknowledges the multilingualism of the region in his introduction. And you have a sort of a bit of a quote here. He says, what proves this double use of the 2 languages, early French and Flemish, in the same provinces and at the same time, are the various authorities, all equally respectable, who come forward practically in favor of both the vulgar Romance language as well as that of Teutonic. Hariolf, the monk of the Abbey of Saint-Riquier, says that at the end of the 11th century, people still sang throughout Flanders, which at that time included Artois, songs that retrace the horrors of the Norman invasions. I find this passage quite striking, given that the volume on Flanders and Tournai was published in 1839, and it seems that it was actually sort of published before it was supposed to be, as Artois was meant to be the 2nd volume rather than what it became the 3rd. And 1839 is, of course, the very year that Belgium is recognized as a separate nation by the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. But what is most pertinent to the topic at hand is Dinault's acknowledgement that in the 11th century, Artois was part of the domain of Flanders, and that the vast majority of this region was, in fact, multilingual. By breaking up the vernacular literature of the North into regional volumes, Dinault implied that the poetry of the region was so diverse and so voluminous that it had to be treated in more nuanced geographic terms. And in doing so, the interconnectivity and complexity of the region and its individual entities could be more easily appreciated. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Dinault's treating of Arras's most famous trouvère, Adam de la Halle. Adam appears in 2 volumes of Dinault's work, in Artois, of course, but also in Cambrai. The justification of Adam's presence in volume 1, the trouvère from Cambrai, is somewhat puzzling. In Adam Jeu de la Fourier, Adam mentions the Abbey of Vaucelles, a Cistercian community founded in 1132 near Cambrai. There's no historical evidence really to justify that Adam was actually there, but we usually kind of have to use Adam's literary and dramatic works to reconstruct bits of his biography. Dinault glosses the inclusion of Adam in the Cambrai volume, stating in a footnote that surely the place of Adam de la Halle would more logically be amongst the Trouvère of the Trouvère Artisienne, but one should recall that the Trouvère Cambrisienne was originally created to be presented during an open competition held by the Société d'Émulation de Cambrai, sort of local learned society. And the society announcement specifically named Adam de la Halle and Géron Dupin, religious of Vaucelles, and this is how they've acquired a place in those of Cambrai, and one might pardon the author for his appearance here. I'm not sure that it's worth making too much out of this single footnote, but it strikes me as a bit of an odd apology. Don't shoot the messenger, Cambrai just wants a piece of Adam. Dinault doesn't seem to have had much of a choice in including Adam amongst the poets from Cambrai, but I think that his appearance in this volume speaks to 2 important things. First, that by the 3rd decade of the 19th century, the Arras poet held considerable influence, and he was a sort of poster boy for the trouvère. Laying claim to Adam was tempting, and it was perceived to elevate the medieval musical and literary culture of other places. And that determining precisely where someone was from in this region was sometimes difficult. Even in a case like Adam, who we continuously associate with Arras, his possible presence in other parts of the region highlighted the connectivity of these places, the way that you can't quite talk about poets from Cambrai without mentioning those from elsewhere. And I think that this is actually one of the benefits of Dino's more regional approach. Volume 3 on the Artois stood out from the others. Although Cambrai also received its own volume, perhaps because of Dino's patronage more than anything else, the volume on the Artois dwarfs everything, aggressively asserting the prominence of this region for medieval musical and literary history. Trouvère Cambrasienne included a mere 20 authors, whereas Trouvère Artisienne featured a whopping 75. And Adam, of course, appears again, with Dino telling us that obviously, certainly, if there's one Trouvère who's honored in the province of Artois in general and in the ville of Arras in particular, it's, of course, Adam de la Halle. So despite his appearance in other volumes, Adam was still the great Arachois Trouvère. In some, Dino's focus on this regionality rather than nationality meant that the movement of poets within the region or even farther away could actually be recognized, and it allowed them to be connected with multiple locales rather than ascribing them with a singular national identity. The complexity of the region and the place of Arras within it was best recognized, however, by Edmond de Coussemaker. Born in Balieu, or Bella in Flemish, de Coussemaker spent the majority of his career in Lille. De Coussemaker was especially committed to underlining the multilinguality of his home region that became the north of France. In a monument dedicated to him in Balieu today, the following words are inscribed just under his name: voor moedertaal in Vaderland, or for mother tongue in fatherland in West Flemish. The quote is in fact the motto of the Comité Flamand de France, an organization founded by de Coussemaker in 1853 in an attempt to protect the speaking of West Flemish in the region. Indeed, it perfectly describes what we know of de Coussemaker. Speaking of his motherland, he was French, and he understood himself as such. He served as general councillor of the North and was, as far as records show, deeply committed to France as a country. But his mother tongue was West Flemish, and he worked arduously throughout his life to promote and maintain multilingualism in the place that he called home. I think we can all sort of share a little bit of sadness that it didn't really work out very well, and I suspect that during his lifetime he saw quite a bit of that. De Coussemaker embraced the regional flavors of northern France, and this is something that extended, as Catherine Ellis has shown, to his musicological work as well. Indeed, his contributions to musicology, and specifically the study of medieval music, are significant, and that doesn't even feel like the right word. His work was much inspired by that of Fétis, with whom he was well acquainted. Building on Fétis's discovery that Adam was a composer of polyphony, de Coussemaker asserted the prominence of his region for the history of polyphonic music. In particular, he noted that a major witness to 13th century polyphony, the Montpellier manuscript, had various Trouvère songs that were found as part of polyphonic works. And as he showed, many of the authors of these songs were actually from or associated with Arras, leading him to conclude that the city was home to a far denser tradition of polyphony that had been witnessed in surviving manuscripts. Of his many publications, his edition of the complete works of Adam de la Halle, completed rather late in his career, is unparalleled. De Coussemaker's dealing with Adam's origins much reflect his own biography. In fact, rather than attempt to extract Adam from the history of French music, de Coussemaker takes an entirely different tactic. Adam is important for quote-unquote national literature and French musical history today, de Coussemaker concedes. The preface to Adam's complete works acknowledges the Trouvère's presence in northern France. But when he begins to describe the Adam of the Middle Ages, he writes, in the midst of this illustrious group of Trouvères who came from Flanders and Artois, Adam de la Halle holds one of the first ranks. Ellis describes how it's not just Adam whom de Coussemaker treats so carefully. So too does he consider other important figures to medieval music, such as Tinctoris, who came from the region in terms that respected the modern political boundaries as well as the complicated past of the era. It's a subtle difference, but I think it allows Adam to be both an important figure in modern identity formation, as well as understanding him in more appropriate medieval terms. What we see then in these three authors, all born on what would become the Franco-Belgian border in the sort of last decades of the 18th century, is a great care being taken not to apply modern conceptions of identity and nationality backwards, an acknowledgement that there's a shared but messy past on this border. Even Fétis, ardent Belgian nationalist though he was, treads with great care in approaching Adam de la Halle. There's no doubt that Gallo-Belge is a charged word, but having read some of his other works, it's far less strong than it could have been. As the profile of Adam de la Halle grew in the first half of the 19th century, so did that of Arras, and it was reimagined as the central landscape of Trouvère song. The next generation was markedly different from that of Dino, Fétis, and de Coussemaker. Rather than focusing on the histories of their hometowns or regions, these were scholars, men trained specifically for the task of creating historical knowledge. Their work harnessed the local and regionalist histories written by the generation before them, but used it to deliberately serve national causes rather than to evade them. By the middle of the 19th century, and with the dawn of the Second Empire, we see a seismic shift within France and how it related to its regions and conceptualized their communities. As historian Stéphane Gaston writes, the early Second Empire broadened its historical and territorial purview. More pertinently, this national history included and even highlighted the patriotic traditions and most generous memories of the local spirit. The French state had thus become an outlet of local memories. What were once local and regional histories were now part of a nationalized project, and medieval Arras was in the process of becoming a key component of French cultural history. I don't want to give too much away too quickly, but we'll see in just a moment that this would not be without its disputes. It's within this environment that perhaps the most significant scholar of medieval Aragois history came of age. Adolf Gesnom was born in 1824 in Planche, Normandy, and spent the majority of his career as a professor at the Collège d'Arras. He became a member of the Académie d'Arras, the city's foremost learned society, still in existence today. Gaston adopted Arras as his home later in life, in a distinct shift from the scholars of the previous section. Thus, his aims for the city were different than those of his predecessors. Over the course of his illustrious career, and I should note it remains impossible to study Arras today without dealing with him on a daily basis, he used his scholarly connections to place Arras and Aragois poets on a national stage. I think Gaston's plan for Arras and its medieval poets is perfectly described in a moment that occurred early in his career. Around 1859, Gaston stumbled across a manuscript that had been thought missing since the Revolution. The manuscript, pictured here, contained a register of the members of the Confraternity of Jongleurs and Bourgeois of Arras, an organization with medieval origins, suppressed during the Revolution, and long thought to have been a patron to the city's Trouvère. What happens next demonstrates that Gaston held deep connections within the city. After all, he found the manuscript, but we don't quite know where, but also more widely. According to an account of the discovery, Gaston, quote, convinced the owner of this curious volume, probably a member of the confraternity who had been keeping it safe, to present it to the administration of the Bibliothèque Impériale or the Bibliothèque Nationale. Along young Leopold de Lille, the famed bibliophile, historian, and eventual director of manuscripts at the Bibliothèque, bought the volume quickly after it was presented to him. Gaston's remarks about the manuscript around 1859 and 60 indicate that he was already thinking about Arras's place in national identity. He makes remarks like, the list of names must contain those of many jongleurs, and on account of this, they ought to be attentively mined by those scholars who are interested in our ancient poetry, or even more assertively. For the public, the manuscript has an importance that's hardly contestable, in that it can serve to shed light on certain dark corners of our manners, our institutions, or even of our local history. The continued use of R in both of these examples is not necessarily a surprising rhetorical device in the 19th century, but I see the implication as being that the local history of Arras can throw light on a more public and national identity. Across the border in newly founded Belgium, another transplant began to think about the national place of the Trouvère for his own adopted country. August Scaler was born in 1819 in Switzerland to German-speaking parents. After the appointment of his father as Leopold I's librarian, Scaler finished his education in Germany. In 1839, he joined his father in Brussels as an associate librarian, later teaching philology at Liège, and finally at the ULB in Brussels. Scaler's academic career focused primarily on philology and linguistics, although his studies of medieval authors, including Froissart, were incredibly important landmarks in their fields. In 1876 and 79, he published a two-volume series, Trouvère Belge, in which, building on the work of Dino, he forwarded a quintessentially national goal. The Belgians, too, would lay claim to the Trouvère. Together, the two volumes comprised 26 authors, in addition to a handful of anonymous works. Although Scaler doesn't state his justification for any single Trouvère outright, certain threads of logic are clear. The vast majority of authors have names with toponyms that indicate that they were from cities or regions that would later become part of Belgium, Deugan or Duc de Brabant. But in addition, Skeler claims a number of trouvères that were from areas that were undeniably within the border of France by the 1870s. I see him as being less interested then in modern borders, but in medieval ones. It's no surprise then that Skeler adopts a few Arigeois or artesian trouvères as well. What's interesting though is that rather than adopting any of the prolific Arigeois trouvères like Adam de la Halle, Skeler goes for slightly lesser known poets. Of the 26 authors included in Trouvère Belge, only 3 had tight connections with Arras. Skeler describes Gilbert de Bernaville as a talented Belgian poet, friend, and companion of the Duke of Brabant, suggesting that the jeu parti that he shared with Henry III, Duke of Brabant, and his inclusion in Dino's volume on Flanders and Tournai justify his inclusion in Trouvère Belge. Volume 2 features Carassus, who's often referred to as Carassus d'Arras, and Laurent Wagon. Like the first example, Carassus may have been included given that 2 of his songs are addressed to individuals in an area that would then become Belgium. The first to Jean de Dampierre, the son of Guy de Dampierre, Count of Flanders, and the second to, again, Henry III, Duke of Brabant. But Laurent Wagon is a curious inclusion. Unlike the other 2, I don't expect that his name would be familiar to scholars of Trouvère song, and that's likely because he's actually never ascribed as an author in a single manuscript, except, of course, by Skeler. The incipit of the song that Skeler ascribes to Laurent bears his name, Laurent Wagon en Couvent, but it's unlikely that Wagon was actually the author of this song. The lyric comes from a famous and, crucially, anonymous collection of lyrics from Arras. And this collection of poetry features over 200 names of individuals active in the city in the 13th century, making Wagon's name in the incipit unlikely to actually be an authorial ascription and just sort of a coincidence that that's where his name appears. There's no doubt that Laurent Wagon was a resident of Arras, though. In documents dated to 1225, he's called a cives atrabetensis, and the documents indicate that he was one of Arras's famed 13th century moneylenders, as were many members of his family. Laurent Wagon is then indisputably connected with Arras. To justify his inclusion, Skeler explains that his name in the first line of the lyric allows him to sort of be called its author. Skeler notes that the lyric is highly satirical, mocking the types of poets from Arras like Adam, which we normally sort of connect with the city. Now, there are good reasons that Skeler carefully chose which Arigeois poets not to include in Trouvère Belge. As Craig Baker notes, Skeler's work, alongside that of his colleague Kervan de Lettenhove, quote, gave the young nation an artistic heritage with distant roots into the Middle Ages, and which was certainly linked to French culture, but without being confused with it. The reluctance to adopt aspects of culture already well incorporated into French history is not especially surprising. As Johan Tollebeek and others have shown, there was an effort to distance the newly formed nation of Belgium from its neighboring France. And by the time Skeler wrote Trouvère Belge in the 1870s, it may have been best to sort of leave the most famed Arigeois trouvère alone. So it's only a conjecture, but I think that the satirical tone of the lyric that he ascribes to Laurent Wagon might be the reason that this individual is included in Trouvère Belge. By mocking the famed poets of his day, or their, quote, vanity, boastfulness, or presumptuousness, as Skeler writes, perhaps this lyric might be considered a contrast to the works of Arigeois poets proudly adopted by the French. The poem following this one by Laurent Wagon in Skeler's volume is from the same anonymous collection. Known as La Prise de Neuville, it interpolates Flemish words into an otherwise exclusively Francophone collection of song. Were Belgium to lay claim to only bits of Arigeois poetry then, this would be the place to do it. Returning back across the border in France, developments in philology, which I'll discuss in the next section, had created a framework for dealing with the medieval past in a highly intellectual, almost scientific way. Although French and German philologists were highly critical of Skeler's work, as Baker reminds us, Skeler's purpose was relatively different from theirs. Skeler's Trouvère Belge was part of the Belgian Royal Academy's Grand Écrivain du Pays, and Skeler worked quickly, or as Baker says, too quickly. The lack of other trained philologists in Belgium meant that Skeler, along with his partner Kervan, had to focus their efforts on more public-facing products, editions that would raise public consciousness about the young nation's medieval past and culture. But this was a double-edged sword. While Paris, Mayer, and other famed French philologists and literary historians annexed Arras and its poets from a literary history of France, there was hardly anyone in Belgium to continue taking up this work. And so in some ways, I think we can sort of see Belgium as losing the war before the battle even began. As the 19th century came to a close, Arras and its medieval trouvère became the domain of a group of scholars, including Adolf Gesnom, whose purpose was to integrate the city's medieval vernacular culture into a larger history of French music and literature. Once again, we see a marked difference in this generation from their predecessors. Like Gaston and Skeller, they were not born in the regions that they studied, but unlike them, they didn't work in them either. They were largely educated in Paris, holding academic positions there and elsewhere in France. They were trained specialists, witnesses to the rise of modern higher education in Europe, and under the impression that their work, unlike that of their predecessors, was scientific. Amongst them are two figures, Gaston Reino and Alfred Genra, who are well known to scholars of medieval song. Reino and Genra almost single-handedly nationalized the trouvère and the troubadour respectively, scrubbing the residue of the fact that the regional song cultures with which they were dealing were explicitly not French. In Paris, Reino came of age in the midst of the transition between France's Second Empire and Third Republic, entering the École des Chartes in 1870 during a period when classes were eventually cancelled due to the siege of Paris at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. Reino was trained as an archivist, paleographer, and philologist, working between 1876 and 89 in the Department of Manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale, cataloging the library's holdings. His Bibliographie des chansonniers français provided transcriptions of old French songbooks, listed songs alphabetically and by rhyme scheme, and offered a full list of known trouvères. The result of such a project, of course, was that the Francophone trouvères were lumped into a singular tradition, very much unlike, a unified whole, in the same way that France attempted to shave off the fuzzy edges of its own complicated past. The significance of Arras, of course, was not lost on Reino, who published editions of the works of two prominent Aragois trouvères, Jean Bretel and Jean Baudel, including biographic information on the poets. Arras, as the ideal tonic to pre-revolutionary interest in the trouvère, returns in his work on Bretel, where he argues that while the lives of the trouvère are not particularly well known, except for those who are aristocratic, Arras presents a special case. The school of Arras, so fertile and flourishing in the second half of the 13th century, he says, but where poets seemed to be recruited, as if by preference, from the humblest classes of society, remains today almost entirely ignored. And it's a true good fortune to find, hidden in an archival document, the name of a gendarme or bourgeois poet of that era. By this point, not only is Adam de la Halle everyman, but so too were the majority of his Aragois comrades. Alfred Genra, trained as a philologist at the École Normale in Paris, his 1889 thesis incorporated the lyric art of the troubadour in the region that is now southern France into a larger national history of literature and music as well. He first worked at the University of Toulouse before moving back to Paris in 1909 to teach at the Sorbonne. And I hope you'll forgive me, but I found this fabulous photo of him teaching at the Sorbonne, and I think it's just really lovely because the class has so many women in it, and this is early 20th century. So I'm going to keep it up for a bit. Although Genra was largely occupied with the Southern troubadours, he too spent time with the lyrics of Aragois poets. First, with Henry Guy, he edited a collection of anonymous lyrics from Arras in 1898, and they noted the proximity of the lyrics' contents with the city's bourgeois inhabitants. Later, in 1925, in honor of Adolf Gesnom, who had died only a few years before, he edited Baudel's Jeu de Saint-Nicolas, largely considered the first vernacular play. It seems only fitting that even the great scholar of troubadour song would honor Gaston in such a way, given the continued and remarkable contributions that Gaston made until his death in 1917. By the final decades of the 19th century, having been working on Arras since at least the 1850s, Gaston's writings about the city shift in a really important way. Having witnessed firsthand the shift from more locally based scholars, often amateurs, to trained philologists, Gaston commented in 1895 that in the half-century that passed since the publication of Dino's Trouvère artisienne, a profound transformation in the study of languages and literature of the Middle Ages has been accomplished. Thanks to the immense progress of grammatical science, the minute combing through of volumes in France and elsewhere, to the ingenious invention of ways of affiliating manuscripts, texts in Old French are now today verified, restored, and commented on with a sure method, a level of critical penetration that was previously unknown, which greatly honors the masters of our contemporary philological school. Gaston then bridges a gap between the mid-century turn to more nationalistic models and the final adoption of the city of Arras by French scholars at the end of the century. Mentioning Dino by name, and clearly with scholars such as Reino and Genra in mind, Gaston summarizes succinctly this transformation that had occurred in the study of medieval literature over the course of the century. While scholars of literature edited works of the Arras Trouvère, Gaston, ever the historian, attended to their biographies, building on the so-called scientific approaches of his younger peers. Between 1895 and 1902, he published major pieces on Arras's medieval poets. The first of these publications focused on only 5, all of whom were members of the clergy. In 1902, another publication on Arras biographies featured a further 25 poets, this time including Adam de la Halle. He built off of the work of his predecessors, not least of all Dino, pairing knowledge of literary criticism with historical sleuthing. As an aside, I think it's quite interesting that in many respects, Gaston seems to see himself as correcting the historical errors of his literary peers. You can almost sense a slight frustration in his writing with their lack of historical precision, saying, well, that's actually someone's son, it's not the same person, while respecting the fact that they have great philological skill. On the surface, Gaston's later work on Arras Trouvère biographies might seem solely a nice accompaniment to the regional editions of Dino. But as Gaston continued his career, his rhetoric shifted to one that was highly national and not at all regional. In the introduction to a biography article on the Arras Trouvère, he states that, quote, one sees the interest of curiosity that's attached to these primitive monuments of our national literature. What was implicit in Gaston's writing before, a notion of our literature, our institutions, if you recall the quote from earlier, is now entirely explicit. Not only did Gaston state that he thought the Trouvère were the domain of French national literature, but he also made clear that they were not the property of the Belgians. Setting aside the critiques of Skeller's method laid out by many of his philological colleagues, Gaston critiqued the very nationalism of the project of Trouvère Belge in 1895, saying that in another satire where, as an aside, August Skeller, believing himself to enhance the literary history of Belgium with another Trouvère, takes as an author of the play one of the actors. The actor who Skeller misinterpreted as the author is none other than Laurent Wagon, the citizen of Arras to whom no poetry is attributed, but who appeared in Trouvère Belge as a poet nonetheless. This critique of Skeller is most notable because it has literally nothing to do with the content of the text, demonstrating that by the end of the 19th century, Skeller's national project was met with open disdain, in large part because the French had successfully laid claim to the Trouvère and in turn to medieval Arras. So to bring a few threads together, I think that what we see over the course of the 19th century are a couple of interrelated things. First, the post-revolutionary need to recover the Trouvère as national literary monuments and highlight new non-aristocratic figures means that we see a new appreciation for Adam de la Halle not seen before the revolution. And in his highly localized literature, Adam began to highlight the opportunity that the rest of his Arras peers posed. It was a city teeming with poets in the 13th century, very few of them aristocratic. And so as Adam becomes popular, so does Arras. And thus the city of Arras marked an important geographic center for the new French medieval literature, making it increasingly difficult for the Belgians to assert any claim over it. I came to this work in some ways out of necessity. I recall my first trip to Arras during the summer after my first year of graduate school. I got off the train and I sat in the Petit Marché. On one corner, there was a fritteur, and it sat across from a Leffe cafe. I recall feeling distinctly out of place when, having ordered fries, I then was overwhelmed by the number of sauce choices and I didn't realize they were going to be sold separately, and I knew I was in a different place. The architecture in Arras, a holdover from the Arras that was part of the Spanish Netherlands, even though it was rebuilt after World War I, also didn't look like anywhere else I had been in France. And there's also, of course, Arras's belfry, pictured here with the Hôtel de Ville, and the géant that processed through the town on municipal occasions, as in various other towns through northern France and Belgium. I had read about Arras for years in scholarly work, but once I finally got there, I didn't know where I was. I couldn't recognize it. Things were also unfamiliar on an intellectual level. My dissertation work was on a confraternity, the very same organization to which the manuscript discovered by Gaston belonged. That manuscript, which was copied between the 12th and mid-14th centuries, encoded the names of 11,000 people and presented two problems that the existing literature wouldn't help me deal with. The first was that half of its members were women, a fact that had been hardly acknowledged. And second, a good portion of its members were also members of religious life and institutions, both within and without Arras, many of them being in Tournai or other parts of what is now Flanders, a fact that sat deeply uncomfortably with the vernacular or secular nature of the community that had been foregrounded. The only people covering these problems, the only secondary literature with which I could put Arras in contact, were historians, largely of Belgian origin, who spoke about Arras as part of the Southern Low Countries, a term that I hadn't heard of before, but which pointed me in directions that made sense of all of these aspects, both personal and intellectual, which had been sitting very uncomfortably for a number of years. What I found then, when I returned to the foundational scholarship of the 19th century, was a rhetoric that, at best, obscured the complexity of Arras's history and the region in which it sat, and at worst, deliberately erased aspects of this history in order that Arras fit more cleanly within a French cultural and literary history. There's been little reckoning in modern scholarship about these issues, about the political and social atmosphere in which some of the principal scholarly literature was created. And I think that although we often know that we have to be very critical of our 19th century forefathers, and they are indeed forefathers in the majority of cases, we sort of forget that there are Belgian authors writing as well. It's one of the small joys, though, of working on a very particular place, and especially a place that's small like Arras rather than a huge city that's very unknowable, that over the years you get to watch it change. And I've seen more change in Arras than just the rise of its Airbnb market. Being in Ghent afforded me the possibility of going frequently, sometimes for archive trips, but other times just for a bit of a writing retreat. I was able to witness these changes from up close, to really start to immerse myself in a way that had otherwise been difficult when I was living across the Atlantic. Shortly after I moved to Belgium, I went to Arras for a presentation by the local archaeologist, which was revealing the finds of recent excavations. The audience was largely public, over 55, and gathered in one of the meeting rooms of the Hotel de Ville. I arrived that morning and I spent the day reacquainting myself with the town. When I confirmed the start time of the event later that day with the receptionist at the tourism office, it was clear that she was somewhat puzzled that someone traveled, even from Belgium, just for this event. But after it started, I was delighted that I was there, because I was struck by the way that the local archaeologist opened by acknowledging the Flemish influence on the city, calling it a ville flamande. It made sense, but it seemed a bit more of an outright acknowledgement of the city's long and complicated history than I had witnessed a couple of years before. By 2017, a new tourism campaign had been launched in the city called Les Enfants d'Arras. Featuring 23 famed Aragois from the king of the 1st century tribe, the Atrebates, to Maximilien Robespierre, the campaign placed plaques outside of the city's major sites. And this is going to move, so I'm just going to warn you. Of course, there is an app for that, where it's supposed to move. So here, this is just a quick walkthrough of this app, the same material that are on these plaques, with audio in French and in English. There are plaques, of course, for Adam de la Halle, as you see here, as well as Jean Baudel, and they sit quite next or close to each other, just a stone's throw away from the Petit Marché. But they betray an Arras that still struggles with its identity, both medieval and modern. And here are the plaques here. Whereas according to his plaque, Jean Baudel writes in Old French, Adam de la Halle was a writer of Picard, the regional dialect. The highly localized way of describing Adam as a writer of Picard contrasts with his significance to French history. But Adam is truly a local hero. There's a strange intimacy in the way that the Aragois speak about him, as if he's still alive somewhere in town writing his next vernacular play rather than 800 years dead. But these plaques, particularly those of Adam and Jean Baudel, display what might be characterized as a continued confusion about the city's identity. We even see small errors that serve more to mythologize them rather than speak truths about the city during the Middle Ages. On his plaque, Adam is mentioned as a member of the, quote, Guild of Trouvères, no doubt referring to the confraternity book discovered by Gaston. But curiously, Adam's name is never inscribed amongst the 11,000 members. It's just understood that he had to have been a part of it. But I think this slight confusion of identity is in fact part and parcel of Aragois identity itself. Any attempt to cleanly define it, to clearly delineate where one part of its past ends and the next begins, is to fall victim to the assumption that Arras is more French than it is Aragois. The way that the Pas-de-Calais voted in the 2017 presidential election is interesting for what it says about Arras's relationship with the French mainstream today. Indeed, when I was walking the 45-minute walk back from the departmental archives into the city one time, in 2018, I came across the remnants of a sign advertising Frexit, a sign not for Marine Le Pen, as you might expect, but for the slightly fringe candidate, Francois Josephitis, who in the first round of the presidential election received less than 1% of the national vote. But Le Pen won the Pas-de-Calais first round overwhelmingly, and the department was one of only 2 in France out of a total of 94 that voted for Le Pen over Macron in the second round with a margin of almost 5%. I think there's something to be said for the fact that a region that was once ardently fought over, which sat neither here nor there, was one of the 2 French departments that dug their heels into highly nationalist rhetoric in 2017. I expect that many in the Pas-de-Calais might cringe at the thought that across the border, Belgians might claim Utrecht for themselves. Indeed, it was one of the weird dissonances of living in Flanders, but working on French Flanders, that I got 2 different sides of the same story. But I think that what it taught me is that there really isn't a right way to talk about Arras. Fetis, Dino, and de Coussemaker, all contemporaries, found different ways to navigate questions of medieval Aragois identity in a critical moment for the rise of nation states in the 19th century. In some ways, although Arras's medieval poets were eaten up and spat out by the French project during the 19th century, I take a bit of heart in the fact that there still seems to be a confusion about where the city lies today. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I expect that we'll see changing national borders in the European continent within our own lifetimes, and it's not unlikely that that will happen in the Low Countries. It seems likely then that Arras's time in no man's land isn't over just yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is clapping going on. People have found the reactions. Yay. So thank you so much for a really rich paper and intrigued by, as you say, the complexity that we can see once we go to that local scale and where you can actually acknowledge all of that messiness and what we can gain from actually paying attention to the messiness. We now have time to open to the floor for all kinds of questions that people may have. We noticed in our briefing before that the chat function seems to have disappeared and we don't quite know where it's gone. So there is, unless you've got a chance to raise something in the chat, but I probably can't see it. So if you want to raise a question, raise your hand. Either physically if you've got your video on, but preferably via the reactions button, which you can find depending on what kind of version of a computer you've got. At the bottom, when you move your cursor over the bottom, there should be a reactions button where you can see raise hand, or if you open the list of participants, there is a button there as well frequently. So that's for the practicalities of how to get me to pay attention to whether you want to participate in the conversation. And I already see a hand, so I'm going to immediately hand over to Ad Putter.
Hi, thanks very much. Fascinating paper on this. Really, yeah, it looked so Flemish, didn't it, the picture of it. I'd like to mention one more hero of mine in this story. He's a little later, so he falls outside your period slightly. It's Godefroy Court. He was the teacher of Pirenne and wrote a wonderful book on the way that language border shifted. I mean, he shows quite well that Arras was well, yes, as you say, there must have been bilingual speakers, but it probably wasn't French-speaking territory. But then that interesting poem you mentioned, the Prix de Neuville, that has these Flemish loanwords, in a book by someone you'll know if you've worked in the Low Countries, Jan Dumoulin.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. In that book on medieval Bruges, there's some wonderful reference to Flemish migrants who were set to work in Arras, and I think that might explain, why you have these Flemish loanwords cropping up in this particular poem. Yeah, I think that was it really. I mean, that would be. I think he refers to some article on this.
Okay.
Flemish migrants in that book on medieval Bruges. So it's this fascinating land and this fascinating topic. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I really appreciate the first comment as well. I think one of the scarier things about doing this work for me is also that it could go on for the next 20 years, because there are just so many people writing. And I think that looking at Turren's work, Arras does come up in the history of Belgium. I mean, it is a place that he does mention. And so I'm kind of trying to toy with how much I want to go to the sort of more straight-laced historians and how they deal with it, because I suspect it might be slightly different as well. Just because they're not trying to adopt a literary history as such. And I think there's a sort of very specific way. But I think that is a very good comment.
Of course, if I can just sing his praises. In the second volume, it's a huge book. It's Godefroy Court. You can get it on archive.org. I can send you a reference to it. He, in the second part of it, surveys the whole question of nationalism and the relationship languages, and I think he was one of the first to kind of distance himself from the nationalistic view of languages, to make the point that really didn't exist in the period, in the medieval period, that is. That, you know, it was quite normal, as he said, he discusses the area of Tournai, to send to swap children. Families would swap children so that it would pick up each other's languages, without any sense that, you know, that is betraying some national.
Yeah. If you don't mind sending me the link to that, that would be really fascinating. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just think it's a wonderful book. I don't know when it was written, but it's not been surpassed. I think it's just absolutely wonderful.
Thanks very much.
All right. About that, like some of that question of the kind of migration, I was curious as well, but because I love your focus on, if once we look at like this specific town, you can see how confusing this is, and how confused, well, not confused, how ambiguous it is. And so I like the focus on the local and how that allows for that messiness. But I'm curious whether you thinking of things like the transregional history that is being written in Leuven at the moment, whether that helps explain some of the, or whether that framework helps to think you through some of this. For instance, with the kind of migration, whether there is an element of really people, because you've got lots of those banking families and rich families, or families with a firm who really clearly work across all kinds of political borders, and like, you go and marry there, so we have our networks. I'm just curious if that plays in this at all, in how people write about this. But also, apart from the local, the regional and transregional, like the universal, do you get a sense that this now gets claimed more in universal terms, or not at all? Whether that's, so a bit about those kind of the various levels that you're thinking on, whether you wanted to say something more on that.
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question. I'll try and sort of answer the first thing. I mean, your mention of the banking families, I think, is the perfect thing to say here, because I mean, there has been great prosopographic work done by plenty of historians before me on these money lenders in Arras in the 13th century, sort of where they come out of and who they're dealing with. And when you look at the documents, they're dealing with people in Flanders, they're dealing with the counts of Flanders, they're dealing with monasteries and institutions in Flanders, you know, lending to the city of Ypres or to Bruges or to Ghent. And I think that was such an exciting sort of line of networking for me to say, oh my gosh, you know, all of these French scholars, they know that this is happening, and they can sort of see this, you can trace it really well. So yeah, I think that's definitely a question that I'm very interested in, is this sort of transregionalism. And I think that there was a moment very early on when I was writing my dissertation where what I had read before kind of had Arras in this little bubble, and that bubble extended to Paris, and that bubble sort of shifted north out of, you know, I had no interest in what was happening between Arras and Paris. There were still obviously things happening, but that it was so clear that we had been sort of missing this really important this network. Can you repeat the second question? Sorry.
The other kind of levels of like an international claiming of this, whether it's these, while these becoming like universal figures as well, for in some, because thinking of the kind of waves in historiography in whether oh no, we shouldn't be nationalist in this, or we shouldn't be regionalist or localist in this, like, oh, these are European figures. Like, is there any way that gets claimed, or not at all?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can't say that I can think of a good example of when someone gets sort of claimed as a European figure. I mean, I will say that at least speaking to musicology as a discipline, France is dominant, until you get to maybe the Franco-Flemish, but even then, as someone who was trained as a musicologist in the United States, there was really a very little appreciation for me of what Franco-Flemish actually meant. And then I moved to Ghent, and then I was like, oh, okay, so it's now Belgium. And then sometimes I remember some of these Franco-Flemish polyphonists are from Arras as well, and I mean, it just sort of blows your mind constantly. You have to kind of continuously rethink that trans-regional thing. But I can't think of an example of Europeanness. I think that's an interesting question. I'll have to think more about that.
Interesting, because that and also in the meantime, if people have got other questions, do raise your hand. But because it is the kind of assumption of, well, France is the central element, and that's what we write a history on, and what you're doing is, and then what lots of people are doing in the kind of, oh, actually France itself is cut up in different ways, and then thinking about the regionality of that.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's fascinating stuff. I see hands. Joseph Mason is the first that I see here on my screen.
Hi, Bri. Thank you so much for your wonderful paper. I had a question about the philologists, Reino and Genra, and really about their approach to editing texts. So I wondered if, have you seen that they kind of smooth out any sort of regional dialect traits that might link texts to Flanders or Belgium and try and claim them for France in that way? I mean, I'm thinking of the way that Reino, for example, will write out interpits of songs that come from Lorraine, but will edit the endings out that sort of signify anything kind of Lotharingian in the dialect.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I suppose the short answer is yes. Of course they do. I think one of the more interesting things for me, I mean, sort of the development of 19th century philology is just such a huge subject, but I think one of the interesting things for me when I was revisiting a lot of this stuff was the way that they critique Skeller. They say, you're not up with the sort of latest developments. You just, do it the easiest way possible. You stick to what the text is in the manuscript. And I mean, that is in some ways for speed, right? I sort of mentioned he's working in this big national project. But there's also kind of an interesting flip side of that, which is that they're all kind of, gathering different versions of the same text, and then kind of deciding which one, how are they going to make it the best one. So you kind of lose all of that regionality as well. So yeah, again, I suppose the short answer is yes, but it's a good reminder that looking at that a little bit more clearly, I think, especially when they edit specifically Irish works, about how they deal with language, because Adam is the great Picard Troubert. I mean, that is kind of how we know him, right? And he gets made fun of apparently for his Picard in Paris. But yeah, I'll have to go back and look at those things.
Yeah, it might be interesting as well to look at, the editors who choose the best manuscript method, rather than the hodgepodge method, and see which they choose to be the best readings in that sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Michael de Preter, you've got your hand up. You're still muted.
Okay. Yeah, I realized. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful paper, Brianne. I really enjoyed it. And unlike Genra, you kept your audience awake, so that's a very good thing on a Friday night. I was wondering about to what extent these different authors, and maybe especially the Belgian ones, are using or calling upon the economic and political space as a whole at that time to claim, and of which Arras was part, to claim the trouvères for one country or another, and especially for Belgium. Again, I was also wondering about Scheller's links with Kervin. Is that Kervin de Letteneuve? And so maybe to see if he used his work to link Arras to Flanders.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you talk about the economic area, you mean the sort of 13th century economic area? Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen much of that in Scalar, which I think is quite interesting, actually. There's not a recognition of those banking families as the event was talking about, which is quite interesting. Although I have to admit, I mean, the project that he and Kervan were doing is just so enormous that I'm not sure I'll ever actually read all of it. But I think it's a good thing to go through archive.org and just kind of search key terms and see what comes up and what doesn't. So no, I haven't seen mention of that. I think that it could be, you know, not to sort of just push on Craig Baker's work more, but I think it could be for the fact that it was just so quick. You know, he's not really going through as a historian. He's just kind of like, okay, here's another manuscript of stuff that's probably from like what is now Belgium. I'll edit it and I'll get it out and people will know it. So there's not a lot of like great historical accuracy in his work. And in terms of the relationship with Kervan, it's difficult for me to ascertain what kind of role Kervan had in Franco-Belgian, which I think is kind of interesting. But it's definitely something I should look more into. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Az, you've got your physical hand up. You're muted.
Thank you. That was such an interesting paper. Really enjoyed it, and also your impression, your own bringing your own impressions of it into it, which I thought was quite interesting and fun. I wondered. I mean, you made a very persuasive case for this kind of progression of views through the 19th century, and I wanted just to ask you about your baseline. Where you know, in the first generation, when you're talking about the fact that there isn't this sort of claiming of national of a kind of national unity in a way, but looking at something which is messy. And I wondered if you could put that into some more context about why you think at that moment that was the attitude.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a really good question. And I think because they're all such different examples and they deal with it in such different ways that I'm not sure I can speak to each of them. I think the figure that I find the most interesting of the three of them, just personally, is de Coussemaker, the last example, this West Flemish speaker who is very committed to France. And I think, you know, in a very naive way, I found him really difficult to understand for a really long time. I was like, what? How is he okay with France? But he wants to speak West Flemish. This is really difficult. And I think I maybe see him as an idealist in a really lovely way. I think he's potentially seeing this opportunity. France is changing so much during the 19th century, it's not true, right? And I think he sees this opportunity to try and make France not be what it eventually becomes, which is this sort of unified, everyone has to speak French, because there's a big push that he does when he founds the Comité Flamand de France in the 1850s, which is to try and make sure that in schools, West Flemish is being taught. That's sort of the big push at the beginning. It's not to edit text, it's not to, you know, it's we have to make sure that our children in this region are taught to be bilingual. And I think that in the context of how quickly France is changing in the middle of the century, how we're going between empires and republics, you know, at the drop of a hat, and no one quite knows which way things are going to work out. I think that maybe he's trying to sort of do whatever he can to make sure that you know, he has his say and that this regionalism in his region is preserved. And you do see that in what he edits as well. He edits, there's this sort of pushed by the French government to find out what the songs of different regions are. So Normandy sort of submits theirs and whatever, and de Coussemaker says, okay, well, you can have some Flemish songs from you know, my region. And he goes and he edits this group of Flemish folk songs and he translates them into French, which I don't quite expect was what the French government wanted. But I think that he's really this idealist. He's trying to sort of show we have this great history, we have a lot of culture, we have to preserve it. So I think he's trying to take hold of that. I'm trying to think of someone else. Dino is much more elusive to me, just because there's not quite as much written about him in the scholarly literature. It's difficult to find a lot of biographical information about him. But I think Fétis is, you know, a really interesting figure. And I think that after he moves back to Brussels, after he becomes the sort of the director of the Brussels Conservatory, you see an even greater push in his scholarship to kind of assert a claim for Belgium to other things. Adam is a difficult one for him to claim, but the Franco-Flemish polyphonists, obviously. And so I think that once Belgium is established, he really digs his heels in. Does that answer your question? Yeah, it's a very good question. Thanks.
I was also, because I also really loved the like the personal reflections on it, on your experiences and seeing this as a regional situation. I was just curious if you could say something more on whether this, like, because you're not a 19th century historian, you're a medievalist. How much is this shaping your work on medieval? So the chapters in the book about medieval history, are they getting a different light because of what you're now doing with this paper and with this work on that 19th century fighting over identification?
Yeah, it's a charged question in some ways, right? Because I think we all like to believe that we can sort of be very objective and that we're not going to sort of put our personal experiences onto the work that we do. But I mean, in some ways I can't, right? When I made the choice to go to Ghent, that was a deliberate choice that I was making. There was a very particular school of history that I was ascribing to, and that I was trying to sort of learn how to become a part of. So it definitely does shape the way that I think about the Middle Ages. I think that one of the things that I'm doing in my medieval work that this definitely influences is, so the 13th century is France. That's how literary and music people talk about Arras. But if you look before then, it's not France. And there's this big problem, but nobody has to sort of look before then, because if you work on Trouvert, there isn't anything before then. So that's easy. But my book is going from the early 11th century. So I have to sort of deal with the fact that there is a shift at multiple junctures in the slightly longer history that I'm talking about. So in that way, I think that actually it did guide my want to do a slightly earlier project, to say, okay, we're going to look at the 13th century, but we're going to go before it too. I want to know where this comes out of. And my work is very much arguing that actually it's Arras's continued relationship with places in Brabant and in Flanders that allows it to become this vernacular literary center. It's not sort of just out of the blue that it does this. It's because it kind of has this financial relationship. It has a religious relationship very much with the rise of the Beguine movement, which is very popular in Arras. And yeah, in so many other ways. So I would be lying if I said it didn't shape it. It does, but yeah, thanks.
I think that's a good thing, right? Like that your history is shaping.
Please, but Elsa Streetman had a question.
Oh, okay, yeah, excellent. Can you?
Hello, Brianne. Thank you so much. I thought that was a wonderful paper, and I love particularly the kind of the lieu de mémoire and the history that you blended so very intimately and personally. I love that. Thank you. I may have missed this in your paper because it was rich. I was wondering what effect the Belgian Revolution, so the 1830 to 1839 split between, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and then there is the Petite Révolution, as it were, which then, of course, also, well, not gives rise to, but really enhances the Flemish awareness of their own past, their literature, their history, their music, etc., etc. And I wonder whether, maybe this is taking you too far away from your musical research, but whether you had any notion that after 1839, that is, there was a particularly Flemish, maybe even Brabant, no, Flemish in the sense of the Dutch-speaking provinces. Yeah. Whether you see an effect of that in historiographical terms.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's been nagging at me actually a little bit. I think that's another, I think it's another good reason though, because, you know, I talk about the Belgians kind of slowly kind of come out. They're no longer in this history, right? By the end of the century, they're not really in the game anymore of dealing with the Trouvère. And I think that maybe that's also one of the reasons though, because obviously there's and I do mention this a little bit, that kind of discomfort with adopting things that the French have adopted, and we don't want to do that. And Flanders, as so many people have talked about, is a lot easier of a medieval history to claim. It's much more cleanly theirs. It's distinct from France in language and other ways. So I'm hesitant to say absolutely yes, because I haven't found very good reasons to, but I think that yes, that is true. I think it's also very striking to me that there really isn't a Belgian until Skeller, who's publishing Trouvère Belge in the 1870s.
Yeah.
So you see this huge gap between the 1830s and the 70s, where there's not anyone, I mean, obviously people are writing in history, but they're not writing, you know, about the literature of Arras as being Belgian. And I think that that's probably very much part of that, a discomfort and a claim more to Flanders than to French things. But it's something I want to think more about, because I have a sense that that's what's happening, but I'm not wholly sure if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much. May I just ask one more little thing? You know, there has been, I think it's now stopped, there is a periodical, Ons Erfdeel, Our Heritage.
Yeah.
And it had the French, it had its French-speaking equivalent in, is it, Ad will help me out here, is it Les Pays-Bas? Les Pays-Bas, was that the other, yeah, Uli, you know that.
Septentrion, I believe.
Yeah, Septentrion, yeah. And you know, it has, I think, come to an end. But that was very much a kind of periodical in which, in these sort of disputed areas as well, there was a real effort to re-erect, to conserve the language, the dialects, etc. Of that area. And I wondered whether it might just be worth your while to put in some keywords in their index, if it is line, which I suppose it is some, but whether that may yield anything for you in terms of further research.
Yeah, that's a fabulous idea. I mean, I've looked at it obviously before, but I've never thought about bringing it into this. So that's a really good idea. Thank you. That could be really interesting and maybe close that gap a little bit. But yeah, thank you.
Good luck with it all. I will have to leave, but thank you so very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for the interesting question. Ben, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks. Hi everybody. Brianne, thank you for that paper, which I found so interesting. But maybe I was a little disorientated at the beginning, product of my own ignorance, really. I mean, of course, your paper, your interest is mostly about modern constructions of medieval Arras and the Trouvère tradition. And it was very revealing as such, very interesting kind of intellectual cultural history of the pursuit of a certain kind of philological scholarship in the 19th century. I found your answer to Lisbeth's question also very interesting in terms of how you then reflect on how this influences your own writing of the subject. But I guess knowing so little about the background, about 12th and 13th century Arras, I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more actually about what the linguistic practices were at the time. And I mean, what is kind of the original material, as it were, out of which these people are constructing localistic or Belgian nationalistic or French nationalistic or other sorts of history. What is the mix of linguistic practices that actually was characteristic of the Trouvère in the 13th century in that area?
That's a really great question. In Arras, we're largely talking Francophone. There's not great reason to believe there's a lot of people who are speaking Flemish, as I think Ad Putter's question and sort of comments also reflected a bit. I think that I'm very comfortable with that. That seems to be very much what it is. It is Francophone. The lyrics of the Trouvère are Francophone. One of the questions that I have in my sort of, I guess you could call it my normal day-to-day research when I'm a medievalist, is the way that we construct the Trouvère actually how it worked. By which I mean this unifying French group of people. Is that really plausible? And the reason that I say that is that one of the bits of an article that I published about women who are musicians in Arras, which has been really understudied. We don't think that women could be Trouvère. That's a sort of big historiographic problem. Women can't be Trouvère. But if you go and you read the work of Frank Willert or Louis Peter Crape, who was a musicologist in Utrecht, you find that Harderwijk is contrafacting, which sort of means using the metrical patterns of Old French lyric, a lot of it from Arras, into Middle Dutch. And so they put those things together. And when I went and read their work, I said, well, I mean, half of these people that she seems to be contrafacting are from Arras. You know, there's clearly like this line between these places. So I think that even if establishing the multilinguality of people in Arras in the 11th through the 13th centuries is very difficult to do, that it doesn't really seem like they're probably speaking a whole lot of anything but French, except for reading Latin, of course. They have a lot of contact with people who are highly multilingual in Flanders. And I think that line of women is really interesting because women in Flanders have a higher degree of education and a higher degree of multilinguality as well. So it's still in some ways an open question for me, but it's not about saying that Arras is anything but Francophone. It's more saying other people who, you know, have Francophone or who have French as a sort of second or third or fourth language even are coming into Arras and they have access to these people. And yeah, does that answer your question kind of?
It does very much. What about local dialect? What about the peculiarities of the French that's spoken there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I am not well placed to answer that, to be honest. I mean, Adputer would be very much placed to answer that question, but the local dialect is Picard, and I mentioned, I think in response to Joe Mason's question, in some of his works, Adam de la Halle talks about getting made fun of for speaking Picard, for having a different type of French. He goes to Paris apparently, and they recognize him as a Picard person. So yeah, I'm not sure if that helps.
No, that's very helpful. I mean, it seems to me to kind of clarify why it would be quite a stretch and more of a challenge for Belgian nationalist historians or philologists to make any claim, and much easier for the French to do so.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I can see no hands anymore at the moment. Oh, I can see a hand by At.
Yeah, I just wanted to come to that interesting question about the dialect there and the Picard. And Picard, probably people you will know, and if not, recommend it. The great Serge Lusignan, a wonderful book on Picard, and he writes on Picard and on the language, and I think he does point out that I mean, there are interesting things in Arras, even in that dialect. Some words, yeah. So which ways of writing, which are sort of, you know, they show Dutch traits. It is. I mean, I was French speaking for sure, but it did have the poem from Arras, which you mentioned, the Prix de Neuville, does have a lot of Flemish words in it, and it suggests that you know, there is familiarity with that language. Whether there were Flemish workers there, you know, migrants, or whether you just had to be, because if you did any cloth trade, you would be working with, you know, you'll be looking north, as it were.
Yeah.
So it is fascinating. And the other bit that's worth mentioning, and I get a bit personal here as well. My old man was very fond of this particular area, the Pas de Calais. And for anyone who's interested in Dutch literature, you know, all the earliest Dutch literature, so much of it comes from is noted down in that area that is now French speaking, because of course the French border then shifted further north, so that now the whole of the Pas de Calais is French speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's more or less gone, isn't it? But it's only place names that remind you of the fact that these parts so much was Flemish speaking. And it comes as a big surprise to many medievalists who write, say, about Calais. And think of this as a French town, because that's what it is now. This place, this was Calais for sure, was Flemish speaking. So this is a wonderful area, and I think it's reflected a bit in that wonderful picture that you showed us of the town itself.
Yeah, you can't really look at Arras and think it's French. It's a bit confusing if you imagine you're going to another French city.
I love that with those, like, lots of Flemish influences or loan words or whatever going on there as well, and you've got the history that I get taught, got the history of Dutch language that I got taught at school was kind of, oh yeah, and then there is this like overlap where the Germans are trying to claim this, but we also claim this, and then there's this overlap with the English. Well, actually the first sentence that we've got is actually by maybe in England, and so that we've also got that with French as well. So secondary schools should also stress that more, fighting the 19th century again. But thank you so much for really interesting paper and continuing conversation about these various identities and the multilinguality, and especially, putting the focus on Arras and making us think about that so clearly. So especially for a seminar, we are the Low Countries seminar. It's very often very northern Low Countries, or then the Flemish part, but now having French Flanders is brilliant. So thank you so much for kicking off our new term. For our next session is on the 19th of February, and that is Michael de Preter, who was here as well. He is here as well. So you're there in my screen on Zoom, and he'll be speaking about the Counts of Flanders, the towns in England, so patterns of diplomatic competition and complementarity in times of revolt in the 14th and 16th centuries. So more transregional and transnational histories. I would normally link to that in the chat, but I don't have the chat. But if you can sign up, it is on the IHR page, and it will very much be also as interesting a paper as this has been. But let's just do another applause for Brianne. And if you, normally we would take you to drinks and dinner if we were in London, which unfortunately we can't do, but we've tried to do some informal debriefing by just sticking around and with people who want to stick around and just have a chat either about something more about the paper or anything else that comes up. So do feel free to stick around and have a glass of whatever you've got nearby. But thank you for coming.